Well, thank you. It's always good to be with you and answer your questions. And I'll leave a lot of time to answer your questions, but make a few remarks. The situation we're facing at the Capitol right now obviously should come as no surprise to any of you or to anybody in Louisiana. We have been talking about this and knowing about this since the temporary taxes were enacted 25, 26 or so months ago. Everyone, I think, knew this day was coming, that the taxes that were going to expire would have to be replaced if government was going to continue providing the level of services that most people want and most people expect. And obviously, particularly over the course of the past year, in the regular session last year and in the special session that the governor called this year, we have been saying that it's absolutely necessary, in order to do what the people expect us to do, to replace a portion of the revenue that is expiring come July 1. And it's pretty obvious that $1.4 billion in revenue that had been approved by the legislature is going to go away on that day. The governor has asked the legislature to replace only a portion of that money. And after we recognize and I put quotes on this, I guess, the benefit that Louisiana as a state government receives from the federal tax changes, because although Louisianians, like the rest of the nation, enjoy a federal tax cut because of the peculiarities of Louisiana's taxing system, our taxpayers will be paying more in state income tax. That meant more money for the state, and we've said all along that when we're able to identify at the REC level what we think those dollars are, that would be factored against the shortfall that we've been talking about for these past months. And so when REC met a week or so ago and recognized that new revenue, it shrank the number necessary to fix the problem in the views of the administration to $648 million, and that's where we are right now. Those in the legislature and those pundits who over the course of the past months have talked about the fact that Louisiana simply needs to live within its means or make cuts in the budget are now being proven wrong, as we've been saying. Both the House of Representatives in its entirety and the Senate Finance Committee thus far have been unable to fashion a budget that makes cuts without devastating various segments of Louisiana. The budget passed by the House simply ignored the health care needs of the state and said, basically, we're not going to fund anything in LDH in order for them to be able to continue maintaining the level of services that they've been making, particularly to optional services. And the optional service component of the Medicaid budget is an awful lot of very important things. Medicaid is an entitlement program. If you are eligible for Medicaid, when you show up, services are rendered to you. The federal government lets states opt to include a number of other things if they want to do so in their Medicaid program. And Louisiana obviously has a number of those optional services that are very, very important to the people of Louisiana, ranging from assistance for the developmentally disabled and those in need of mental health, to optional services like nursing homes and even hospital coverage, which we don't really view as a luxury. These things are necessities for the state of Louisiana. And the budget passed by the House basically said we're not going to fund those things. There's not enough money to do that. Funded TOPS, something that's very important to all legislators, I think, and certainly very important to the governor, to the tune of about 70%. So that budget obviously was subject to a good deal of criticism, both by the administration and a number of folks who are observing this process. The Senate Finance Committee last week, in an effort to try and reverse those cuts imposed in the healthcare arena, showed us what it's like when you are going to try and fully fund the healthcare needs and what you can't do to take care of other needs in the state. And we went through that, or a partial list at least, of that laundry list of things that are adversely affected by the budget that came out of the Senate. And I understand the Senate will hear the bill, I'm not sure what day this week, but within the next several days. Obviously, the intent is to get out of here by the 18th and have a special session next week. So tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, my guess is you'll hear that budget on the Senate side. And we'll see what happens there. I can tell you, as I think you all know, there's not going to be a miracle fix that will arise on the floor of the Senate. There's no way to fix this budget. The only way to enact a budget that is going to meet the needs of the state in a reasonable and fiscally responsive way is to replace a portion of the revenue that rolls off on July 1. And the special session call will go out today. The session will begin on the 22nd, on Tuesday, and then we will have an opportunity to match up the revenue that the legislature is willing to raise with the expenditures of state government in a way that we will know what additional revenue is available. And I am very confident that you're going to see a significant amount of additional revenue recognized by the legislature. Some will do so reluctantly, but I think they will do so out of reality and necessity to make sure that we are able to fund TOPS, we're able to fund higher education, and not impose a cut after this being the first year that we've not cut higher education, and at the same time take care of all the various health care needs that are in jeopardy as a result of the bill that left the House. Now, I had originally said that we would not have an REC meeting in May because there's not going to be any real change. But in discussing this with the leadership of both the House and the Senate, I am going to have an REC meeting. I'm the chairman now, so I get to call the meeting. We'll have an REC meeting on Tuesday before the special session begins, but that should not be any cause for joy because we're not going to recognize any new revenue based upon my conversations with the two economists, both of whom had recommended that we not have the meeting in May because they didn't feel like they would be changing their forecast. But in order to avoid any concern that we're trying to shield some new revenue from view, we'll have that REC meeting and publicly discuss what the revenue picture looks like and when we may expect to see some improvement. And I think that will be the case in June when we have the May numbers in. We'll have another month of the income tax withholdings having been modified to comply with federal law, and we'll have corporate income numbers in, although those are not the be-all and end-all of where we stand from a fiscal standpoint. But we'll have those numbers in, and hopefully we may see some indication of more positive movement then. I don't know that even by that date we'll see a change in the forecast because the forecast anticipates these rises and falls in revenue to the state. The economists have been doing this for a while, and they recognize that there are going to be good months and bad months, and April is always thought to be a good month, and so the little spike that we saw in April was expected and was already factored into the revenue estimate. But nonetheless, we'll have that discussion as well before we embark on the special session. The governor remains very optimistic. He'll speak to the press this afternoon, and as do I, both of us being optimistic by nature, that we will finally get to a point pushing ourselves all the way to the brink, almost all the way to the edge, before we decide what the resolution is going to be so that we literally do not face a shutdown of services that we so very desperately need in this state. So really that's what I wanted to say to you. It's not a lot of whole new news, but I really would rather answer your questions and talk about concerns you have or questions you have about this process or about where we may be going. I think the real bottom line point here is that you simply cannot make cuts that will be acceptable to the public or the majority of the legislature given the current state of revenue in Louisiana. And we've been saying that for some time. It's now reality is hitting, and people are recognizing they're going to have to do something. And that something is going to be some combination of revenue, nothing really different from what we've seen in the past sessions that will be debated and will be decided in order to try and see if we can reach the magic $648 million number that we need to make sure that everything remains funded. And still, we'll see about $120 million in cuts that we will incur, even if that number is reached, because obviously we're not looking to replace the entirety of revenue that's falling off the books. A considerable amount less than that, which means there will be additional cuts. So with that, let me answer your questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned concern about allaying concerns that there were revenue being shielded. Can you explain the administration's active lobbying against House Bill 760 that would have shed more light on the detailed numbers of the budget such that the legislators could have had access to that, and how that may not open up the administration to saying, the administration said we consistently believe there's still hidden things down there that we can cut and we're not being provided access to.
I would if I could, but I don't know the details of 760 and hadn't been involved in any lobbying myself one way or the other on that bill or really any other bill. So I don't know. If you tell me a little more about 760, I'll try and take a shot, but I really don't know the details of it.
Well, 760 was an attempt to provide the legislators with the same identical access to the specificity of the budget that the governor's office enjoys.
Well, they enjoy that same specificity right now and have it throughout the process. But again, I don't know exactly what it said, and I don't know why it met its fate. I assume it met its fate because I guess it was heard. I honestly don't know any of the details about
Well,
it.
Lance Harris appeared here 3 weeks ago, and not only did the Republican Party put out a social media video that was deemed pretty effective, but he readily said the administration lobbied against it. And Jay Morris, when he was doing his closing argument, said, no one better not come up here and tell us, show us the cuts when they won't even show us the numbers.
Well, I don't think you'll get much debate in the legislature, including from Lance and a number of the Republicans, that this has been the most straightforward and candid and honest administration that they've dealt with when it comes to telling the truth, not trying to mask what's going on in state government, and leaving everything available for people to review, answering every question, providing every document. A dramatic change from what everyone had seen in the past. It's what led us to this situation where a lot of the prior spending tricks were masked so that no one knew what was going on. So I will wholeheartedly defend this administration's openness and candor and straightforwardness.
Can you make sure you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yes,
Okay.
Robert.
Surprising media is all over you already. Let me ask, did you say May 22nd, Jay, on the date? Is that what I heard?
Tuesday, I think it's the 22nd.
Okay, and so the REC meeting would be tomorrow?
No, it'll be that probably right before the session goes in.
The same day, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And what is the governor's view, as I understand it, has been that he didn't want to see a budget pass this session. Does that mean he would veto any budget that gets passed this session?
Well, he's going to wait and see what the budget looks like. There's a lot up in the air right now. I think he has said, and we've talked about the fact that if the budget looks like it came out of the House, or if the budget looks like it came out of the Senate Finance Committee, it won't become law. But there's still processes underway. I don't see how there's any way that the legislature can find the money necessary to create an acceptable budget, which is why we've been arguing that the exercise that's underway right now is one that should wait until we know how much revenue we actually have to pair that up with the expenditures. But I think it's the thinking of the legislature that they ought to try and pass a budget while they're here, knowing that the revenue is not yet available. The governor has said he's not in favor of contingency budgeting, the above the line, below the line trick that is being used, but that's the way it stands right now. And at the end of the day, we want a budget that reflects the real numbers based upon the real revenue that's available.
Okay, just to
Yeah.
clarify, so he may not sign it, or he may veto it, that's still possible.
That's right. I'm going to leave it to the governor to answer what he's going to do about vetoing, but he's expressed his displeasure with both of the budgets that are in play right now.
Jay, on Friday when you and Cameron Henry were discussing shortfall, there seemed to be a difference in numbers. Have you all come together and identified the problem? The 2% using 400 and something, and you were using 6.
The question is do we have an understanding on a difference that the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and I had in an interview on LPB last week, where Cameron suggested that the budget shortfall was lower, and I have no idea what he was talking about. I don't know how he's calculating that. No one has contested the fact that the REC has indicated that we're $648 million short of what we need to fund the budget, still with $120 million in cuts. You'll have to ask him to explain that, because I couldn't understand the explanation he gave then, and I don't know what the basis would be to suggest that a smaller number is needed.
Jay, the $120 million, is that general fund cuts? And that's would be a larger number?
Yes, general fund cuts.
Okay, so it would be a larger number in terms of programmatic, so that would be matched.
Well, we probably would not involve a huge amount of matching dollars, because we would try to be much more targeted with the way we're cutting, so that we're not sacrificing federal dollars by making those cuts. And those are some of the examples I talked about Friday with the Senate. Even with getting out of the Medicaid program, you still lose a considerable amount of federal dollars, not nearly the amount you do in the Medicaid program, if you start cutting things that draw down federal matches or that represent money that we would have to repay the feds. For example, if we had to close some of the facilities involved with the military, we'd lose some money there. In other areas, we would have to pay back money that the feds gave us to build a facility that we would no longer be able to operate. Not to mention the concerns about the SNAP program, where we literally, our obligation as a state is to administer federal dollars that come in for the SNAP program, and look at the budget for Children and Family Services. It's impossible for them to be able to do that and to look out for the needs of neglected and abused children and foster children and do the other work that the department does. So there's a potential significant loss of federal dollars under the current iteration of the bill, but we don't believe that current iteration will become law either.
Are contingent appropriations constitutional?
No, they're not, and I have to say that with an acknowledgement that in the previous days there has been contingent funding. Back in the days when I was in the Senate, we did have a couple of budgets where we had contingencies. It wasn't constitutional then; it's not constitutional now. There was never a challenge to it because it was a short-term maneuver. Frankly, recognizing that the temporary taxes that were in place back then were going to be renewed shortly thereafter, because that was back in the day that I hope we're not going to repeat now, where every couple of years we were renewing temporary taxes. It's what led to the success of the Stelly plan, as I've talked about before here, where there was finally a recognition that 20 years of temporary taxes was not a fair and honest way to deal with the public's money, and it brought us a great deal of criticism from the bonding agencies and the rating agencies, and we changed that, but we now seem to be creeping back toward that mindset. And the governor's been very adamant that we're not looking for a temporary solution here, just to patch us to the election year or patch us for a year or so after that. We need to fix this. We need to fix it now. If there's subsequent changes that come about in the future because of a constitutional convention or because of other changes that the legislature seeks to make, then that can be dealt with then. But the message Louisiana needs to send is that we're fixing our problems, and we're fixing them in a responsible and permanent way, and we're not just going to kick the can down the road. If they had an American Association of Can Kickers, Louisiana would be a charter member, and we need to end that.
Jay,
Yes, sir.
have we gotten past the very obvious statement of, the Republican strategy really is just to deny the governor or anything? Is that what the strategy still is, or is this political theater, or are we actually going to get to something different?
The question is whether or not we've gotten beyond the so-called political theater that has been going on, where the Republicans were trying to deny the governor success. And you'll have to ask those who have been advocating that viewpoint the question. We're not quite there yet, obviously, because we faced that problem in the previous regular session and the special session. And when the House passed the budget, some of the leadership called it a responsible budget and said we don't need to raise more money, we need to make further cuts. And I think that's now been proven to be an inaccurate and misleading statement. The budget that the best budget the House could pass was the one we got. And when the Senate tried to provide a counterbalance and say, no, we're not going to go that route, they, by their own admission, have a work in progress that isn't that much better in terms of doing what everybody wants to do. So I think we all now recognize that it's time to deal with the reality that we're facing, be honest about the budget needs of the state, find the money to do what we believe needs to be done, make some additional cuts on top of the ones that have already been made, and let's try and provide the kind of budget stability that will let us move forward and repeat what we've been able to do in this fiscal year. Despite criticisms heaped on the governor as to the financial well-being of the state, this year TOPS has been fully funded. Higher education did not sustain a cut. We've been able to maintain our health care services. We have a surplus in the current year, and that's what you want. You're never going to budget to an exact science, but you want to end the year with a little more than what you thought you were going to get, rather than a little less than what you were going to get, or a lot less than what you were going to get. Yes, sir.
Been serving the public for quite a few years. Has the word compromise disappeared from the language?
The question is whether the word compromise has disappeared from the language around the Capitol. I don't think it's disappeared, but it's under a lot of stress right now. And I think it's pretty obvious we haven't seen a compromising spirit to bring everybody together. To the contrary, we've seen these polarizing budgets and the inaction of two previous attempts to fix a problem that everybody knew was coming, pushing us to the brink that we are at today. So I hope compromise hadn't become a dirty word. It's not. It's part of the process. It's not. It doesn't represent weakness on the part of one side or the other. It recognizes the reality of who we are as a democratic society, that there are going to be competing interests and competing philosophies, but a recognition that for the greater good and for the people that you represent, that public is much better served by an agreement between two opposing parties instead of a complete disagreement that would lead to chaos or would lead to the kind of devastating impact on Louisiana if we can't get this fixed in the next 6 weeks. Yes, ma'am.
I heard an interview this morning with Cameron Henry. One of the points that he made was that we had the highest Medicaid costs of any state in the country. Would you characterize that statement as fairly accurate from your point of view?
I don't know. I don't know what his source is for that, and I'm sure you can look at Medicaid budgets differently in terms of what their cost per person may be or what goes into it. I know this. We have a disproportionate number of poor people in Louisiana who are dependent upon Medicaid services, and we have a utilization rate that has resulted in us being at the top of very poor lists. And one of the ways to try and save money is to identify illnesses early, to begin treatment early, to have preventive care, prenatal care, the kind of things that the Secretary has indicated we're trying to work towards. So those base numbers are what need to change. And I think all of us, be us Republicans or Democrats or rural or urban, whatever we may be in Louisiana, I think we all ought to be able to recognize that if we have a smarter and healthier population, we're going to be a better state. And we ought to go about the business of trying to make sure we accomplish those goals with a responsible use of the money. So I can't speak, the question was whether or not we have the highest Medicaid cost in the country. And I know this. I've worked with this department now very closely over the course of the past couple of years, and the people there are very dedicated. They're not trying to mislead people. They're being very candid with providing information, and they're receptive to suggestions that change things. For in one of the examples, and the debate may be going on right now at the Capitol in the Finance Committee meeting, is changing the reasonable compatibility calculation for Medicaid eligibility, and we're going to drop it to 10% instead of 25% because our 25% was high and was inappropriate. And we talked about that and said, in this case, we think they're right, and we ought to agree to do that, and so we're doing that. Mm-hmm. John?
A while ago, you said that the governor prefers permanent fix. Is adopting in the legislature's wisdom a quarter of the cent, the penny that would be due on considered a permanent fix, or some portion of that penny?
The question was, is the quarter penny of sales tax or some portion of the sales tax considered a permanent fix? The quarter penny doesn't get us there, I don't believe, given the other components of the solution. If it's a half penny, the governor's position would be, yes, let's make that permanent. Let's not play these temporary games any longer. Let's make that permanent, put in place whatever the legislature is able to agree upon, and if at some point in the future there's a determination made that shouldn't be as permanent as it is today, then that can be changed. I mean, that's the legislative process. Laws are passed and laws are changed. Tax policy is set and tax policy may change depending upon circumstances. We'll probably, it won't be me, but 5 years from now or so, we may be having a conversation about the federal government reversing the income tax policies that were put in place this year because they're temporary. And that could change the entire way that Louisiana looks at its tax system because some of the things we've been advocating that have not been implemented, like deductibility of federal income tax on your state return, that may be something we want to implement if all this is reversed. It worked to the benefit of the state in terms of its budget this year, but it'd be just the opposite if these federal tax cuts were reversed. So you've got to change with the times. Permanent doesn't mean it's written in stone and will never ever be changed. It means we're not going to create another cliff and another precipice for everybody to realize we're going to come to, because that is bad policy. It makes for bad politics and it makes for bad results. Yes, sir.
I'll try to address the 800-pound elephant in the room. Given the blowback that transpired, particularly on the part of Senate President John Alario with regard to your testimony on Friday. If the clock could be rolled back, would the administration still proceed forward with sending out those nursing home letters?
Yes, we would. And the reason is pretty simple and basic. First, this administration's policy has been to be candid with people and not to try and hide things and delay things. We didn't think and don't think it would be fair to wait until 10 days before someone has to be removed from a nursing home to tell them that they got to get out. Secondly, the federal government requires a redetermination of eligibility. Now, let me back up. I don't know if I said. The question was, would we roll back the clock and not send out the notices to the nursing homes? The federal government requires that when you're affecting eligibility programs, and there were 4 eligibility programs that are being affected by the budget as it left the House, when you do that, you have to make a redetermination of that individual's eligibility for Medicaid. You've got to find out if they may be eligible for some other relief that would keep them covered. And that process has to begin, and it would involve, in many cases, contacting the individuals. Rather than a simple phone call just coming out of nowhere, we felt it appropriate to give this written notice that emphasizes this may happen, not going to happen until the feds say it's going to happen, but to put them on notice that it could happen. And so that was a real important part of our consideration, that notice needed to be given. People needed to be aware of it because the redetermination was going to be made. And that was the primary motivation behind doing it. It was very carefully worded, and it was not done without a lot of careful thought as to whether or not it was the appropriate timing. I delayed it by about a week. The committees were told it would go out May 1st, but we wanted to wait a little bit longer, refine the language, and talk to CMS. If it had been done for scare tactics, if it had been done for political purposes, would have sent out notices to 1 million people instead of 37,000 and told them, call your legislator to fix this. We didn't do that. We weren't playing those kind of games, but yes, we believe the notice was appropriate and was necessary. We regret having to do it because we didn't want to reach this point. It's why we had a special session earlier this year that would have avoided that eventuality if the legislature had been willing to address the revenue problem back then.
Well, then, I have a quick follow-up. Do you totally dismiss Senator Lario's statement in that regard that that this was premature and that the Senate was never provided with an opportunity to weigh in on its priorities that might could have avoided the need for sending out this stuff?
It wouldn't have avoided it anyway because the bill is a work in progress as it left the House and as it left the Senate committee. And had we waited until the Senate committee may have chosen not to make cuts in Medicaid, we would have been that much closer to this potential deadline. So that's why we felt it was necessary to do it, and we hate to have to do it. We hope that it can be rescinded and never implemented and nobody's coverage is going to be threatened, but we're certainly not there yet. And when the legislature had bites at the apple last year and this year to make sure it didn't happen, they didn't bite. So we're hoping they're ready to bite come next week. Yes.
I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about the special session, how long it might be. We've heard a lot from people who say that, the legislators are just tired of being at the Capitol constantly in special sessions. The last special session did not go well. So I guess, can you tell us how long it's going to be and why the administration has any confidence?
Yeah, the question is how long do we think the legislative special session will be and why the administration has any confidence that something will happen? Is that a fair characterization? It'll begin on the 22nd. It'll end on June 4th, I believe, and I will defer to the governor's announcement this afternoon because that was our discussion we had earlier. The governor said all along we want the session to end when the regular session would end, so we're not into the per diem business beyond that June 4th date. So that's I guess it's about 2 weeks or a little over 2 weeks, right around 2 weeks to be able to get it done, maybe a little bit less. I hadn't done the counting, but it's enough time to get it done because we all know what the challenges are and what the issues are. And frankly, we know what the solutions are going to be. The call is going to be very broad. It's going to include a lot of options that people want to see by way of revenue because the legislature has asked for that. And the governor has said, tell me what it is you want to do to try and fix this, and he wants to give them the opportunity to do it, but we also feel like it needs to be very focused. And I believe, given the fact that no one has been able to hold up a budget saying, see, we can cut our way out of this mess that's acceptable to the public, that's going to provide the additional motivation that legislators need, particularly some who have been reticent to support revenue, that they will be willing to do so in this session because they realize we're up against it, and that fiscal year's end is looming dangerously close, and this is going to be the last chance to be able to fix it, unless we would have yet another special session if they fail come June 4th. And we probably would, because we're not going to give up and just acknowledge that, that this state's going to be so as irresponsible as to not have a budget. Robert.
What about that confidence on the sales tax? The special session wasn't support from the Black Caucus for one, among others. But has the governor now reached some middle ground with the Black Caucus on that sales tax increase? It seems to me that's the critical piece.
Question is, has the governor reached some common ground with the Black Caucus on the sales tax component of it? And the answer is, I don't think you can compare what went on in the special session to what may go on in this special session. As you know, there were a lot of other dynamics at play. There was an insistence upon the part of the Republicans to put a lot of so-called budget reforms in there, some of which were and some of which weren't, but became problematic in terms of how people were voting on revenue sources. And unfortunately, linking things together became the problem that prevented a lot more success in that special, is my personal view. And you won't have that problem in the next special session. And obviously the governor is talking to all sides involved in this issue to try and find a consensus. And there's not one yet. There's not a plan everyone has agreed on yet, but I think everybody in good faith recognizes that there needs to be a meaningful solution. And I hope and I think they'll be coming into that special session with that attitude. Obviously, there are competing interests for the limited dollars that we have, and the goal will be to try and satisfy as much or all of those interests based upon the revenue that is raised. And I'm talking about the need to fully fund TOPS, for example, keep higher education whole, yet not make devastating cuts in the Medicaid program. And that'll all be part of the discussion that takes place, I think, as people are weighing what revenue measures they're willing to vote for.
If you end this session early, will there be some other issues carried over additionally into the next special session that you may be?
The question is, if we end this session early, will there be some issues that will carry over into the special session? As we sit today, the answer to that is no, and I don't think you'll see the governor broadening the call beyond the ability to address the financial needs of the state. That's the flashpoint right now, and there's nothing else as important as those focused issues of how do we raise the necessary dollars and how do we then spend them. Yes, sir.
How does the price of oil impact the revenue, and what is the current estimate?
How does the price of oil affect the revenue estimate? It's not a major factor in the estimate. For example, with oil being hitting in the 70s or 75, everybody was great, problem solved. Well, no, problem not solved. And talking to the economists about this, they take a very long-term view of what those oil prices ought to be. You've got to reach a certain level, and it's pretty close to that number, I believe, between 60 and 75, for a sustained period of time where you start to see the production activity coming back in Louisiana. And that's what they have to really see, some confidence that production is coming back to justify an increase based upon the price of oil. And I don't remember what the number is right now, to tell you the truth. I can't remember what we landed on because we talked about a couple of different differentials, but it's not nearly that high, and I don't think you'll see it changing anytime soon. Bill, you had...
Yeah, I was just going to ask you today, the U.S. Supreme Court has approved to allow states to have sports betting. Given the potential revenue, the fact that Mississippi's ready to go with it, is there any chance the Louisiana legislature will revisit some of this sports betting?
You're going to have to ask the Louisiana legislators that question as to what their appetite is to do that, and I think there may be a bill pending in this session that does. I don't know what the fate of it has been, but I think with the Supreme Court ruling, it is going to open the door for that to happen in a lot of states, and my guess is Louisiana has seldom seen a form of gaming or gambling that it doesn't like, and so with the court authorizing that, I would guess we may very well get into that business too. Yes?
You mentioned Louisiana would be a member of the kick the can down the budget.
I mentioned that I hoped it wouldn't be.
Well, I guess it would automatically then be a charter member of the 49th or 50th organization. And recently we just had the graduation rates for high school announced. Texas is 10% higher than Louisiana, so if it was a travel By the time Texas got 10 miles down the road, Louisiana would be at 9. We got to 20, you couldn't see Louisiana anymore. Why doesn't this administration propose a budget that would achieve Louisiana's potential instead of what appears to be on a national basis, seem to be groveling at the very bottom for the most minimal? Is there a reason for that?
So the question is why the administration doesn't propose a budget that puts more priority, I guess, on education, you're saying, Kate?
Not just the whole potential that Louisiana should achieve. Looking at Louisiana, Texas is just a sister example.
Looking at Texas as an example, why wouldn't we try and emulate that? And a lot of times we talk about how we'd like to be like Texas. They've got a lot more people than we have, and they got a lot bigger budget, and they have a lot different taxing system. And they depend upon property taxes to fund things at the local level, particularly education. One of the reasons why they may have the success they have is because they have independent school districts, and they're able to raise money at a local level instead of the system Louisiana has, where our local school districts are very heavily dependent on the state for something that's ironically called the minimum foundation formula, where the state contributes something to at least do the bare minimum, but it's oftentimes difficult for local boards to raise any additional revenue. And raising the money is not the be-all and end-all. And your question really suggests the bigger problem of trying to get off the lists of poverty and health care and everything else that we struggle with. And that's the challenge we have. And I think we all recognize that. We're not where we want to be in any of those areas. The answer is not always just getting more money to throw at it. It's being strategic and smarter on how you do it. And that's one of the things this administration has tried to do and will continue to try and do to try and maximize the results that we get. The rates improved. That's a good thing. They didn't go in the other direction. They went in a positive direction. And we're not going to change this state overnight, based upon the decades that have led us to the point we're at today. But if we keep being honest with the people and doing things in a manner that is consistent with that honesty, we're going to make some strides, and I believe we will.